Okay, y'all, listen. I spent all weekend working with .NET Maui and really digging into its guts and core and all that, throwing together a toy kind of demonstration app. And in this video, I think I'm going to walk you guys through it so you can see how I designed the structure of the source, how I did certain things. We're going to talk about how some of the binding works and the general kind of getting to know .NET Maui type stuff that I learned over the weekend. So if that sounds good to you, stay tuned. All right, so first things first, let me just talk about the app itself. I've got it running right here in an Android emulator. This, it's pretty basic. It's just a list app at the moment. I've got some ideas though of cool features I want to put in here that I've never seen in a shopping list app before. So I will talk about those ideas probably later on in the video. But for right now, I'm just going to show you the very basic functionality that it does right now. So this is the main page. You would click a list, okay? And then a list has items. These items have states, checked or unchecked. That's have I completed it or not, whatever. There's titles. So this is, shopping list, barbecue, Coke Zero Red Hot, whatever. I click one, I bring up some details and an alert, no big deal, whatever. And then, I can create new list if I want to here, a new item, if I want to there. I can click this to go back, or there's also the back navigation. And then I also have a flyout menu with settings, with some basic settings. Okay, cool. Very basic stuff, but once you get through all of that, you're well on your way to being able to make whatever app you want, right? There's other stuff outside of this that you may want at some point, but this is kind of the foundation. That's what the app does. I'll also say there's other nice features that Maui kind of has built in. So for instance, if I change this Android emulator to dark mode, because I used specific things in my stylization, I can open it back up. Now we're in dark mode. Okay, so that's pretty neat. Though I will say you can't see the icon. I need to figure out how to do swap icons based on mode. But other than that, it works pretty well. And you can kind of, style it on the fly like that. So that's the app itself. Let's start to dig into the code, and I will show you first the structure of the source, and then I'll talk about some of the services I wrote, and then we'll talk about the views, the models, and the ViewModels, the MVVVM. MVVVM. And the other thing I want to talk about is how I was doing unit testing, because it turns out it's a little tricky in .NET Maui, and I want to talk about that and show you how I did it and how I'm able to do it, though I will say it's a pain. So just know that going in. But all right, let's dig into the code. All right, so let me move this emulator out of the way onto my other screen. First thing we're going to do is I want to talk about, usually how I think about these types of things is I like to kind of start at the base level. And in this case, the base level is our data, our database specifically. I'm just using Sqlite. If you're not familiar with what Sqlite is, it's a database that used to kind of kept on the machine that's running the application. It's stored locally versus for instance a server where you would connect to query the database. But SQLite is just that. It's kind of a light version. It's kept locally to the application or to the on the device, and it's very fast. It's very nice to work with. And in addition to that, I'm also using a package, a library called Sqlite-net, Sqlite-net. And that is a library written, I believe, by Frank Krueger, if you ever heard of him, who basically just gives you some really nice things with SQLite, and in fact does a thing where you are able to, it kind of does some ORM type stuff for you. So what that means is, for instance, I can do this query here. Well, let's see, looking at a generic query, I'd do. So for instance here, right, I can make a generic query of type T. Let's call it get query by name. So we're going to pass a name, and the SQLite connection has a method called query of type T. And basically what it does is it runs whatever query you give it. And the tables that are created in your database are by object. So in my app's case, I have two objects in the model. I have an item and then I have a user list. Okay. So when this starts up, this will do this create table method, which basically goes out and says, all right, in our database, do we have a table called items? Do we have a table called user lists? And it literally just takes your objects and creates tables for them. That's what I mean by ORM type stuff. So, you know, object relation, like, so basically, so your tables are your objects, you know, and then from there, I wrote in this service here called database handler. I just wrote a bunch of generic functions that give me my, you know, like basically expose the SQLite connection to the outside stuff outside of the service. So it's all just generic queries. I'm just doing really basic stuff in here. Insert t type data. You know, the one thing to note on, I believe it's one of these, I believe will actually return the item. Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah, it is insert here. Basically, the SQLite connection method called insert, you pass it an object and it's inserting it into its, you know, object table, and specifically notes here, inserts the given object and updates its auto-incremented primary key if it has one. The return value is the number of rows added to the table. So, you know, you give it an object, it inserts the object and also basically updates its ID. And my models look like this. And this is the other part of the SQLite, Sqlite-net stuff that you do. When you create a model, for instance, your properties, you give them this attribute called column, which defines a column in the database. There's other attributes you can use as well. You'll notice this ID says primary key auto increment. And that's what I'm talking about in that insert. Is this ID is the primary key for an item in the database. And every time we make a new item, we auto increment the ID. So these are unique basically. And that's important because when you give this insert a object, it will update. If it has an auto incrementing property, it will update it. And for instance, in my case, add one or add, you know, whatever the next sequence in the ID is, it'll add that and put it in the ID of the object. That's cool that it does that, but important to note that, you know, if you're calling this and you're giving it an item, you want that item back with the correct ID, right? So you need to then return it. So in here, I've got insert of type T new data and return type of T, because, you know, it's updating this through reference and then I need to return it back. So anywhere I use the insert, you'll notice that right here. So I'm returning the result of the insert. So hopefully that makes sense. It's a kind of a quirk that you need to think about as you're doing this. Okay, so anyways, sorry, kind of got on a tangent, but basically we've got the SQLite database handler and it handles all this stuff. I wrote it as generically as possible, which was fun. I just note that I'm not a professional C# developer, .NET developer. I'm actually a mainframe developer, but I'm learning this stuff and know it sort of well. And so a lot of this stuff is I'm going to be doing for the first time. So if you have criticisms or feedback you'd like to give me, please let me know. I'd love to hear how I should have done something better. I love that kind of stuff because it helps me learn. So, but this was kind of my first experience doing a lot of generic stuff with C#, and it's kind of nice. I don't mind it. It's, I mean, you know, it's not that different than say Java, but yeah, it's pretty good. And I was able to make this very generic database handler and then have all these other services that handle specific models. So for instance, user list service, it creates a database handler, and then it goes through and you get your operations you need. You create a user list, delete a user, you know, CRUD, right? So that's the services for the most part. I got another one I'm going to work on that will end up sorting a list, and that's going to be important for features later on. But in general, all the services are dealing with database communication. So, and back to our models. The models are pretty much just these properties. Let's talk about user list. So the user list, it has an ID in the same way an item does, which is the primary key in the database, has a name, a target store, which again, I'll talk about that as a feature. There's this attribute from Sqlite-net called one-to-many, which basically says, I've got a list of items. So a user list contains a list of items, and I'll talk about how that's connected to the items in a moment. And then, yeah, just some constructors. So then in items, if I come over here and I say, so if you look at this parent ID, so parent ID is a column on the item table that basically relates it back to a user list. And we do that with this attribute foreign key and then type of user list. So it knows that, okay, parent ID is my foreign key back to the user list table. Cool. Yeah, and everything else is pretty standard. I mean, just, it's pretty much just properties. It's a model. You know how it goes. All right, so that's how we handle database communication, and that's our models. That stuff's pretty basic, probably makes sense, but let's talk about the more XAML Maui focused stuff. So in the MVVM model, you have views, which are your UI, right? And I'm going to talk through this like you've never seen XAML before. So XAML is a XML-based kind of UI definition type language, whatever. And basically it is literally how you define your UI. So if I bring back my emulator, let's just look at this page here. So this is the page you're looking at, and this is its XAML. You've got grids. So a grid is how you can lay out on a screen, right? A grid makes sense. Collection view, which is what these two items are. They're part of this collection view. And in fact, if I go here, you can kind of see the layout. So main page grid here, collection view here, and then there's two buttons. You notice these two buttons down here. It says get user list and create new list. That's what's down here. Okay. So if I press this, it does a thing. And then there's an activity indicator, which this is so fast you never see it, but basically it's just, a little spinny. So, all right, so that's collection views, a collection of, a way to view a collection. And then we have a data template. So you'll notice this collection view has an item source of binding user lists. What does that mean? Well, if we go to our view model for main, which is user list view models, you'll notice there's a observable collection called user lists. Observable collection is it's a system.collection object model item. And basically what it is anytime this gets updated, it's bound to that view, and that view will also update. In my view model, you'll also notice a bunch of attributes. So for instance, query property, well, I'll explain what that is in a little while. There's iCommand, which I guess a little while as well. Oh, there's not one in here that I was looking for. Let me look in here. So, okay, for instance, this observable property is what I want to talk about. Observable property comes from the community toolkit.mvvm. And what that is it's a toolkit that Microsoft supports, but I believe it's community made, which I mean, Microsoft made it, but anyways. And what it does is it gives you all these kinds of helper things. And I promise you, you want it. Because what it does is it takes all the boilerplate that you would normally create out of an MVVM application and generates it automatically. So instead of doing all this crazy on event update notify BS that you have to do to kind of make sure your view and view model are as decoupled as possible, I can do this one tag and this one attribute observable property. And what that does is it goes into, so for instance, in here, analyzers, toolkit, MVVM, source generators. And then in here, there are observable property generators. And you'll notice my user list, well, all these. So this, I'm in user list detail right now, user list detail view model. It generated all this code for me, which is doing all of the on property change junk that you would normally write. And it's just generated automatically. The only requirements are you have to, let me find it. You have to inherit the observable object class. And that is, again, from the toolkit. And I'm doing that in my base view model. And then the detail view, for instance, is taking that in. So this is inheriting that. And that gives me the ability to do this. And so now, anytime user list is updated, anything bound to it in the XAML will also be updated. So if we look at user list details, there is user list here. So we are binding, this collection view is binding user list.items. So anytime .items is updated, this stuff will be updated. Pretty cool. So that's what we mean by binding, is we are binding things in the XAML, in the UI, to the data through the view model. And the way we're doing that, so the way it even knows about that stuff is, for instance, this X data type view model, user list detail view model. There's the class user list details, which points you to the code behind. So if you've never seen XAML before, there's also code behind as well, which is uselessdetails.xaml.cs. And there's code behind in here, which I've been trying to minimize as much as possible, but for this one, I needed a checkbox click. And so I really needed an event type. There may be something in the toolkit for that. I don't know, but I ended up writing it, and don't judge me. don't judge me. So anyways, so there's code behind which binds your view model to the bind context. This right here is probably the most important line that gives the view the stuff in your view model. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So anytime a user list is updated here, it'll be updated in that view. So like right here, if I randomly had a button that said add an item and I clicked it, it would just pop up because the onNotified method and all this stuff were called as part of the boilerplate code in here. So all right, so that's how stuff gets bound to the XAML. There's also ways you can call commands. So you'll notice this entry text binding UL name, return command binding on user list completed command. And that is in on user list completed. But you notice it doesn't say command here, but I've got this attribute I command. And this is another thing from the toolkit, and it creates a command with all this stuff in it, relaying around, basically giving the view access to this command or this method. In here, in this entry text, which we would see if I click create new list. So entry text. So binding uname is how it will be bound back into the code, and placeholder list name. So you see if I type my new list, that's going to be bound to UL name. And then when I press enter, this return command is going to fire. So it's going to fire off the command that's back in our view model. So the store I want, Whole Foods, because we're bougie. All right. So I'm going to press enter, and now I've got a new list with that information. I'm not displaying the target store here yet, but just know that it's there too. All because when I pressed enter or I hit, whatever, I was done, the on user list completed command fired, which is on user list completed. So it created a new user list. It set its name to the UL name. Remember, that was bound to our first thing in the entry. It set our target store to the UL target store, which was the second thing in the entry. I called my create user list from my user list service, which saves it to the database and gives it back with the updated ID. And then I did what is how you navigate in Shell applications, which Maui comes default with Shell. What we do is we do this command here, shell.current.goToAsync, and this right here, ... means go back. So whenever this fires, this will go back to the previous view that it was in. And then I'm passing some parameters. I'm passing a ulist.id, and I'm passing this create flag equal true, just like you would in like PHP URLs or whatever. Okay, so we're going back. So when I pressed enter, it went back to the main screen because of this, and it also passed this information. And the main screen knew to update. So this is how you do navigation. And all of this fired because I pressed enter on my new list. Cool. All right, let me show you how I'm doing the touch. So when I click a list, it goes in, right? Well, how's it doing that? Well, okay, so I got this tap gesture recognizer, and so when I click a frame, this picks up the fact that I clicked it and does what we tell it to. So in here, the command I'm giving it is this very complex command that basically I got from a video I watched, that basically says user list detail view mode or view model path do the command, go to item detail command, and pass it a binding of this thing, and our thing in this case is our item. So it's a tap gesture recognizer inside of our frame. So that's how I'm registering the clicks. Uh-oh, we blew up. All right, the app crashed. Don't know why. Let me just click that out. Okay. All right. So from here, yeah, let's see, what else can we talk about? So, you know, a lot of the XAML stuff you'll have to learn. It's not the nicest to use, but you know, as you go, you'll figure it out, and you know, you'll know like how to define your columns, how to define your rows. You'll figure that stuff out. I think it is a pain as someone who hasn't done a lot of UI stuff. There have been times where I've been very frustrated in terms of I want it to go here, but it's not going there, you know, that type of thing. And I'm sure it's for a dumb reason or because of like grid nesting I'm doing or whatever, but that was one frustration I had. You know, UI stuff is what it is, I guess. All right, so we talked about view models. Let's see, what can I, oh, the parameters. Yeah, so you know, I mentioned that when we did that navigation, if I can find it, right here, when we did this navigation, we passed some parameters. Okay, cool. But then how does those parameters get into the next module? And the way they do that is through the query property. So in this one, I'm backing up to here. So you'll see, you remember I passed an ID and a create flag? Well, that's what this query property is doing, is basically getting those, and we're attaching it to something in here. So the property create flag in the URL gets bound to a property in here called create flag, which is right there. So when that comes back, this gets set. And they do work in order, by the way. So the first one happens and then the second one happens. ID, which is also was passed when I created a new list, I passed its ID back. That's getting bound to new list ID, which is right here. And then I wrote a custom setter that basically says when we need to add in a new user list to the actual user lists thing. And the reason I was doing that is because I had a situation where I would navigate back and it would pass a new one and it would add it every single time, and I did not want that. So I wrote a custom thing to say, well, okay, did we create one? If so, then create it, and then, you know, get its information, add it to user lists, and then set the create flag back to false, just to kind of control how many of those get created. So just wanted to point that out. Okay, let's see what else. So the other thing to note, so Maui, you register, you do this kind of dependency injection thing where you go through and you register all these things. So I register services, view models, the views themselves, so main page, input, you know, all that. So there's two types. There's add singleton and add transient. Singleton means there will be one copy in memory, and it's a singleton. So if you know what a singleton is, there you go. But it's just the one, and its state will be passed around, but it will continue its state. Add transient means there will be multiple copies, and they, you know, you will lose data between creations of copies, right? You're not just passing one back and forth. You've got different instances. So that's the difference. So for instance, on item input, every time we create an item input, we don't want the old information to be pulled in from the last item you made. That makes no sense. So we want a transient. But if we're going to, you know, look at this list here, we only need the one list because it's the main screen and the data on the screen. So there's no need to remake it every time. Okay, let's see. What else can I show? What else is important? You have to register your routes. So you throw all this in here. So any view you have, you put in there, and that allows you to do things like this. So if I wanted to go back to the main list screen, I can call this method, which does shell.current.goToAsync, and it does / name of main page. So it knows, because I registered it, where that's at, and it goes back to the main page. So if that method is called. Here is how I display an alert to show this information. It's very basic. I'm probably going to do that differently in the real app. This is kind of just getting some foundational stuff in here. What else can I show? Okay, let's talk colors. So let's see. I don't see where I'm. Oh yeah, right here. So you can set individual colors if you want. And the way I'm doing this is with this thing called a static resource, which I'll show you where that's at in a moment. But just know that static resource secondary is equal to this color here. So I can say color equals for this item in the XAML, and I end up with that color. Cool. But what is static resource secondary? So if I wanted to, I could just say white right there, and it'll be white, you know. But we're doing the static resource secondary, and the reason for that is it makes it easier when you're swapping light and dark mode, for instance. You can pick those things up automatically. So if I go to my resources folder and then styles, there is a colors and a styles. The styles will actually basically give you default style information for different types. So here's an entry. It's default. So its default background color is transparent. And then they do app theme bindings. So the default app theme binding, if you're in light mode, is equal to black. And if you're in dark mode, is equal to white. So this is how you control the difference between light and dark mode with this app theme binding. So in this styles.xaml, you have all your different types. So here's a list view, here's a picker, progress bar, radio button, and they all have different things you can change. So if you really wanted to change a color for every type of an item in your app, so for instance, if I wanted every button to be a certain color, I would go in here, find it, and then change it, button. Okay, and then the colors, which is also good to look at. I went in here and changed primary, secondary, tertiary, you know, that kind of thing. White is now not white. That's interesting. But I went in and changed these, and that's how I kind of did this default theme. I just threw some colors in there, man. I'm not a UI designer. But that's why, you know, I just pick some colors. And so if I swap back to light mode, and now it's different, you know, and it's because the light mode colors changed. So, yeah, so you can go in here and change these colors, and then you can refer to them back when you are changing your styles, and in general when you're styling a specific item in the XAML. So, okay. Yeah, I mean, there's probably a lot more to look at in here. You know, I don't know. It's pretty basic, right? Like this app is pretty basic. I'm sure you can get much more complicated with this stuff. And you know, there's probably more things you want, but in reality, you're talking about data. How do you store the data, which in my case is my Sqlite database? How do you access that data? And that's through my services. How do you view that data? And that's through the views. How does the data get into the views? Well, it's from the ViewModels, and you're done. That's MVVM with some services, right? That's an app. Maui is, I'll say it's been pretty nice. It's been pretty cool. I really like the fact that I can test this on an Android emulator and then, you know, run a Windows app. I wish I could do it on my iPhone, but I can't. I don't have a Mac. So, but other than that, you know, and don't tell Apple this, but I'm thinking about buying a Mac just for that. But Maui's been really nice. I really like that it's one project, except when it's not. And let me tell you about this story. So I said, you know, I wrote these services and I was like, well, I have no idea if this is working or not. I need to test this, like actually test this. And so I was like, okay, well, let me write some in-unit tests, right? That's cool. In-unit, we love in-unit tests. And so I did. I wrote some in-unit tests. Let me load my test project. So I wrote shopping list test project and wrote some tests. Cool. All right, so we ran them, we're fine. Well, at first I couldn't run them because it turns out these tests need you to build to .NET 6, right? .NET 6, it's the, Maui runs on at least .NET 6. And these in-unit tests need a .NET build to run against. So by default, you're not doing that. You're building .NET 6-Android, iOS, Mac Catalyst, and the Windows app. But you're not building just .NET 6. So what I had to do was go into the shopping list, the project, your Maui project file, and I had to change the target framework to include in the front .NET 6.0, along with all the others. I got it commented out here because in a moment I'll tell you why. So you add the .NET 6.0. Then I went down here and added this constant called .NET 6 target. And if my target framework is .NET 6.0, this is going to be true, whatever. And then the other thing is in here, I added code that said, okay, well, if we're a .NET 6 target, I need a main. And the reason for that is without it, your tests can't run, basically. You need an entry point. So all that was great, and then I was able to run my unit tests against my services. Awesome. Works great. I'm unit testing a database, so it looks a little funky. There's like, I'm ordering the tests in very specific orders and all this stuff. Don't judge me, whatever. So I had unit tests, and I wrote all these services, and it was great. Then I went back to run the app some more. And for whatever reason, I couldn't. I could only run it on Windows machine. None of this, all this was gone. And I don't know if that's a Visual Studio bug or what, but all of this was gone. I could only run it as the window app. So I did all my testing on a Windows app for a long time. And then I said, you know what, let me figure this out. I'm gonna figure out what to do. So I undid all that stuff, which is why you saw it commented out, like here and all that. So I undid all that stuff. Still nothing, didn't fix it. I ended up reinstalling Visual Studio, still didn't fix it. Oh, and to be clear, I also unloaded this project. Okay, I did all that stuff and couldn't get it to work. So I figured out, finally, I ended up going into settings and figuring out that I needed to reattach the process. So I had to go in here and find my emulator that was running and reattach this to it. And when I did that, then I was able to close Visual Studio because it needed elevated access. It needed admin rights. I closed it, it opened it back up, and then that stuff was back. So there's something about adding the .NET 6 build target to your Maui app that breaks the Visual Studio attachment stuff. I don't know if that's a bug. I'm going to look and see if I can find if there's anything out there, and I'm going to report it and see what they say. But just know that if you're trying to get unit tests, it's a pain and you lose some functionality until you undo what you did. So, but those are the steps. You add your target framework .NET 6, you add this, you add the main into app.xaml.cs, your backing code for your app. And then if you have your tests in a separate project, just note that it has to be a separate project as well. So, but hey, you get unit tests for 3 services. Rocks. But okay, so I'm gonna report that bug. We'll see what happens. Now, let's talk real quick about the ideas I have for this app. All right, so, it's at the moment, this is a basic list app. You can make a list, cool. But the idea I have, and this is something I've wanted for a long time, was a list app, a shopping list app that would sort and give me an efficient path to buy my groceries. Okay, how is that even possible? So every store in general, Walmart, for instance, let's talk about Walmart. There's a layout, there's a specific layout that is common among them, and then there are things that are not common among them. Common, for instance, is they put the milk at the back of the store. Why did they do that? Well, depends who you ask. But if you ask, A Walmart person, I don't know what they would say, but if you asked, Joe Schmo, they'd probably say, well, everybody needs milk. So they put in the back store, you have to walk through everything else to get to it. Okay, cool, whatever. Doesn't matter. The important thing is they all put it in the back of the store for the most part. Not all of them though. And if a user uses my app, can I guarantee that it's back there? Probably not. I don't know. So how would we even do this? Well, my first idea, I've got two ideas basically. The first is I need a lot of data, and I can build a recommender system, a neural network, whatever, some kind of ML model that would then say, oh, you added barbecue to your list. Well, barbecue is usually in around these aisles. So I'm going to sort it, oh, A3, that's an early aisle. That's pretty early on in the process. So I'm going to sort it. I'm going to put it up higher up so that as you enter the store, it's the first thing on your list. You go right there, you go to the next one, you go to the next one, efficient, right? So an ML model, how would I get that data? Well, I'd probably, I think at this point, end up scraping Walmart's API. They have an API, and I was looking at it, and I think it might actually do what I need. Basically, I just need a bunch of information about aisle location on different grocery items. So I'm going to look into that. I even have a friend that works at Walmart corporate. I may even hit up, see what he thinks. So I'm going to get all that data and build an ML model. If I do that, I'm going to do it on this channel. So I want to show you exactly how I would do that. The second idea is an individual web scraper. So each person's app, they would mark their store, their target store for this list. And then they would, I would go out and scrape Walmart specifically for their store and categorize everything that's in their store by aisle, sort them, good to go. That one's probably easier if that's possible, but not as cool though, right? And then you might have noticed in the settings, I have started backup store for psychos that want to do that, my wife. And I also have get frozen refrigerated food last. And that's just kind of a setting of no matter where everything is, I want it to hit the frozen sections last so that I don't have frozen stuff sitting in my cart the entire shop, that kind of thing. So that's the idea for the app. There's other features I want to implement. In fact, on the README, I just threw them out here. Nope, so I didn't forget about them. Sorting by aisle, I talked about that. Creating new lists, starting with last week's list. I want to be able to kind of give a user a phantom list when they create a new one of their last one used. And just, maybe they can confirm if it looks good or whatever. So I think that's a good feature, because if you're anything like me, I buy the same groceries every week. I don't want to think about what's different about this week. I know not everyone's like that, but me, I'm just like, man, I don't care. I'm just here to eat and live. So I'm going to buy the same stuff every week because I liked it enough to get it the first time. Let's keep going. That kind of thing. So create a new list from the previous list. Oh, and this is, I forget exactly what the point of this was, maybe related to this one, but, so that's the idea for app. I'm going to probably continue to build the app on this channel. Might do some live coding sessions and just kind of see how that goes. I'm new to all this stuff, so it's a lot of documentation reading. So, that may not be that entertaining. Maybe I cut that out. Don't know. But I do plan on working, continuing to work on this app on this channel. As I learn more about .NET Maui, we may do more cool kind of UI stuff as I learn it. Whatever. I think it's gonna be really fun. So I'm really loving .NET Maui. I think it's a great framework. I never really got to use Xamarin or Xamarin Forms that much, but I've always heard good stuff, and I always thought it was a great idea. And yeah, I mean, Maui it shows that Microsoft is supporting this stuff even longer. They wouldn't be putting this out if they weren't going to. So that's a great sign, and I'm very excited to build some apps with it. So if all of that sounds good to you, then let's do it. Let's get in there and build some Maui apps. So I'm going to keep building this thing on the channel as I go, and I'm going to take you guys along for the ride. All right, so if that sounds good to you, then let's get going. Let's build more into this. I will say I do have, if you have seen all of this, you thought that was great, but you're not set up and running with the Maui build system yet, I do have a video that is right on your screen now that tells you exactly how to get up and running. So if you want, click that video. Otherwise, subscribe for more content like this, and let's get going.